All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the second webinar sponsored by Perspectives on Public Management and Governance, PPMG. We are delighted to have so many of you on this Zoom call. We had over 300 people registered, and we've got now 124 or 5 and growing. So we'll add some more, and this session is being recorded, so we will be able to put this up on YouTube at some point as well, so everyone will have a chance to listen in or sit in. This enthusiasm seems to suggest an active interest in our topic, theory and theory building in PA research, which is the focal interest of PPMG's mission as well. And your presence here this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are, is great news for us and for our journal host, Public Management Research Association, PMRA. So thank you for taking the time today. I am Kirk Emerson, the editor of PPMG, and with me are 3 panelists and PPMG authors, Joris van der Voet, Patrick Kenis, and Gregg Van Ryzin. Joris is from Leiden University, and he studies how public managers respond to change and affect change within their organizations. His 2019 paper, Organizational Decline and Innovation in Public Organizations, won the Camilla Stiver Award for Best Paper published that year by PPMG. Patrick Kenis at Tilburg University needs little introduction as a prominent organizational network scholar. He also served as a co-editor for PPMG for several years, and his paper, co-authored with Jörg Raab, entitled Back to the Future, Using Organizational Design Theory for Effective Organizational Networks, was included in PPMG's 2020 symposium issue on organizational theory, co-edited by Andy Whitford and Brent Millward. Gregg Van Ryzin is from Rutgers University, and he studies a range of public management topics, from behavioral performance to representative bureaucracy and citizen satisfaction. Gregg was founding co-editor of the Journal of Behavioral Public Administration and currently is a co-editor of the International Public Management Journal. His essay, entitled Nudging and Muddling Through, appeared in PPMG last year. I'd also like to recognize, before we get going, my editorial assistant, Phi Tosa Turano, who has made this webinar technologically possible. Thank you, Phi. And speaking of technology, since we have so many attendees, unfortunately, the format won't allow you to see each other, and your microphones will be muted. But please write your questions and comments in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the session. The presentations are going to run for about 50-60 minutes, and we have an extra 30 minutes then to scroll through and respond to as many of those questions and comments as possible. And as I noted, the session's being recorded, and we will be posting it for future viewing. So I'm going to start off by highlighting a few points from my essay and then turn it over to the panelists to introduce their own work and talk about how they approached theory and theory building in their papers, what theoretical claims they were making for purpose, what inspired them, and a bit about what their own process of theorizing was. So let's begin. And if I can put up the title page for my essay. I want to start with a confession, though. I frankly didn't think much about theory for most of my career. I've been a pracademic, as they say, moving in and out of academia and practice in local and federal government for, I have to admit, 40 plus years. To the extent that I thought about theory, it was pretty much as a pragmatic instrumentalist, focusing on making and implementing policies and organizational missions. It wasn't until I took on the challenge of being editor at PPMG about 5 years ago that I really started focusing on theory and theory building in public administration. And at that time, I did understand that PMRA and its founding parents were concerned about the state of theory, or lack thereof, in PA research when they decided to launch PPMG. I quickly came to realize that I myself didn't fully understand what theory was all about or more importantly, how best to assess theoretical contributions of the manuscripts I was receiving and reviewing at PPMG. And if I didn't understand theory, then it was likely that many others might not either. So that's the genesis of this essay and the questions it addresses. The next slide, please. Here we go. You're on it. The purpose of my essay was not to give any definitive answers to these questions, but rather to synthesize and make sense of what several long-standing scholars in the field of public administration and allied social science disciplines have been claiming about theory and theorizing. It's a starting place, perhaps a sounding board, especially for students and emerging scholars to consider their own take on what theory means to them and how they might situate their own work in a more explicit and coherent theoretical context. As PA researchers embedded in the applied fields of public policy and management, we tend to lead with the empirics, while letting theory follow, sometimes stumble behind. The mission of PPMG is in part to encourage scholars to consider reversing this sequence. I'm not going to talk about each of these questions today. I'm expecting the panelists to do a better job of that themselves by responding to them in the context of their own work. But I thought I would touch briefly on the first question about what is theory, and the last one on how to evaluate theoretical contributions. So what is theory? The product of theorizing. This is a question that has plagued not only public administration, but social and behavioral sciences as well. And while there are many different responses to this question, I think it's important to try to simplify, if not demystify, what theory is as much as possible. And to start, a reasonable and very basic definition of theory relevant to our field is a statement or claim about concepts and constructs and their relationship to one another. Next slide. With that simple definition, with that in mind, I think Whetten provides a useful set of questions to guide our inquiry into those concepts or constructs and their relationship to one another, some of which are descriptive, causal, or contextual. So consider for a moment the research you are working on right now. What is the empirical phenomena of interest described in terms of concepts or constructs? And how do these concepts or constructs relate to one another? And how can these relationships be characterized, for example, as a directional sequence or a pattern of causation? And then what I'm sure you're quite interested in, why do these relationships occur? And not finally, but in addition, the contextual questions of who are those influencing or influenced by those expected relationships, and where and when are these interactions occurring? I think it's safe to say that in our field, we may tend to zero in on that third causal question and give the descriptive and contextual questions somewhat short shrift. There are arguments to be had that I mentioned in the essay as to whether the answering of descriptive or contextual questions are sufficient in themselves to merit theoretical standing on their own. I think all of these questions are important dimensions of theory and theorizing, and they should all be of lively interest to us as researchers wanting to explore fully the multidimensional phenomenon or phenomena that we are interested in. That is not to say that a paper that carefully and deeply gathers evidence from which to derive a meaningful construct, perhaps one that has yet to be described previously, is not valuable in its own right or as a necessary first step towards causal claims and contextualizing. So let me move on to the last question in my essay. Many of you, particularly young and emerging scholars, are undoubtedly interested in how to write a theoretical work and get it published. Given the simplicity of our field, no single standard for theoretical excellence can possibly apply. However, in the literature that I reviewed for this essay, I found 5 sets of criteria that might be drawn on as they fit the purpose and performance of the theoretical endeavor, including clarity, logic, evidence, relevance and utility, and value added. Those first three are related in their contributions to what I would call conceptual coherence. Clarity in the portrayal of theory and how our research question or puzzle relates to that theory requires theoretical coherence. And by this, I mean how you each question to your theory, your research questions, and how they cohere with the theory you're drawing on or developing. Perhaps the biggest challenge for attaining theoretical coherence is in how to balance parsimony and contextual depth. That is a tension, unfortunately, that remains with us throughout our careers. But one possible approach to resolving that tension, aside from the ruthless final cutting to meet word count limits of journals, might be to parse out our inquiry by the 5 questions that Whetten raises. Questions of description and context will certainly take more detailed development, while causal claims drawn from theoretical assumptions must be as simple and elegant as possible. Logic, the second evaluation criteria, speaks to the coherence of the research design and how it connects to our theoretical argument, our research question, and our mode of inquiry. Suffice it to say that logical coherence requires careful development and articulation of why and how we have set out to study these particular phenomena and how they're related to one another. And the criterion of evidence suggests a methodological coherence and how we move from the theoretical constructs and their relationships to operationalized variables and appropriate means and methods of analysis. The last 2 criteria, relevance and utility, along with value added, move beyond theory building to contributions to the research and practice communities we serve. I particularly like Corley and Giola's suggestion about 2 forms of theoretical utility, scientific and practical. A contribution is scientifically useful if it demonstrates, quote, an advance that improves conceptual rigor or the specificity of an idea and or enhances its potential to be operationalized and tested in the future. A theoretical contribution is practically useful if it provides guidance to professional managers and policymakers regarding important pressing public problems and how they can be managed. Finally, to value-added contributions of our work, there are many ways to add value by testing, improving or transforming existing theory, borrowing from other theoretical traditions, bridging across different theories, as well as building new theory. And as a research community, we need to continue to challenge existing theory, ask new questions, seek new forms of evidence, and offer and test original insights derived not only from the literature, but from practice and our own experiences and curiosity. So I'd be glad to entertain questions about this essay or anything I've said today, but let me now turn it over to Joris to learn about a new theoretical framework he has created to understand the effects of cutback strategies on innovation.
Thank you, Kirk, for the opportunity to be part of the seminar with so many of our peers from around the world present. Yeah, we'll talk about this paper that was published a couple of years ago in PPMG journal, and the title of the paper is Organizational Decline and Innovation in Public Organizations, a contextual framework of cutback management. And the paper does not seek to develop a formal theory, but rather it presents a framework about interrelationships between cutback management strategies, organizational innovation, and also contextual variation. And in the talk, I will outline a little bit of the substantive framework that I present in the paper, but mostly I would like to dive into some of the topics that Professor Emerson presents in her essay and also just now in the presentation, and these concern the motivation that I had to develop this conceptual framework, Secondly, the process of developing the framework, mainly discussing some points that sparked some of the theorizing and inspired me. And thirdly, the use of the framework, going into some of the points that Professor Emerson mentioned in how we can evaluate and appreciate theoretical or conceptual contributions in our field. So the paper is mainly motivated by my interest in the presence of financial decline, fiscal squeeze, and resource scarcity in and around the public sector, which has been omnipresent now for, well, maybe as long as we can remember. And I'm generally interested in how this affects organizational behavior. And implicitly or explicitly, it seems to me that policies of fiscal squeeze, they are tolerated or sometimes even advocated by policymakers, by managers, or by politicians with the ambition to do more with less. But the actual evidence base that we have on the relationship between financial decline and innovation is actually very ambivalent, as is also expressed in competing theoretical positions. And those are often summarized in terms of necessity as the mother of invention, which sort of proclaims a positive relationship between financial scarcity or decline and innovation, versus necessity as the mother of rigidity, which posits that innovation is negatively related to organizational innovation. And for me, those sort of competing positions, they were interesting to me because it sort of raises the question, in which situation does either of those conditions or mechanisms prevail? I think also this relationship between organizational decline and innovation, it's of relevance for public administration practice. And it seemed to me in public administration practice, speaking to practitioners and speaking to managers, this relationship in which I was interested, it was often sort of conjoined or confused, in the sense that practitioners tend to speak about making smart cuts or finding innovative ways to cut back. And to me, it seemed that this sort of reduces or limits their ability to analyze or to understand this phenomenon in a productive manner. So these observations, they led me to consider the ways in which management could determine the direction or the sign of the relationship between organizational decline and innovation. And sort of the baseline idea that I started out with was that organizational decline, it can be beneficial or it can be detrimental to organizational innovation, but this ultimately depends on the way that decline is managed. Fai, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll say a little bit about the process of theorizing in between parentheses, because I don't think of this framework myself as a formal theory, but there are a lot of existing ideas and resources that inspired me in developing the framework. Firstly, I think the public administration literature, it has a very rich it's a very rich field in terms of different conceptualizations and ideas regarding cutback management, and many of them dating back to an era of research before I was sort of interested in this topic, or maybe even before I was born. And this literature, it spans several decades, usually peaking in times of renewed economic recessions. And as a consequence, it's quite scattered and it's quite conceptually diverse. So as the basis for the paper, I developed a conceptual synthesis of cutback management strategies, relying on two different dimensions. Firstly, relying on an existing distinction between targeted and proportional cuts that inform when, where, and how cuts are distributed in organizations. And secondly, based on more contemporary work, a distinction between closed and open cutback management strategies that distinguish with regard to the degree in which widespread participation is used to design and to implement cutbacks in organizations. The second source of inspiration for the framework, it was provided by the availability of well-established theories in the fields of management and organization sciences And those I could use to relate those above mentioned dimensions of cutback management strategies to the dependent variable in the framework, organizational innovation. And among those theories are, for instance, behavioral theory of the firm, threat rigidity theory. And the main expectations developed in the framework are that open and targeted cutback management strategies are positively related to overall levels of organizational innovation, and that proportional and closed strategies tend to have negative effects. Some sort of maybe somewhat more forced source of inspiration also came from the PPMG reviewers during the process, who encouraged me to differentiate the theoretical expectations to specific types of innovations, such as service innovations or technological innovations. And finally, the paper, the framework, it took a lot of inspiration from research in public administration that explicitly addresses the role of contextual variation, most notably the JPART article by Larry O'Toole and Ken Meyer. And I think the inclusion of contextual variation in the framework, it allows for the incorporation of propositions concerning situational circumstances in which the different dimensions of cutback management strategies can be expected to be present. Thank you, Fa. You're anticipating really well on what I have to say, so this is going very smoothly. And this is just very briefly an overview of the different elements on which the conceptual framework rests. So at the heart of the framework, in the middle, the two dimensions of cutback management strategies, which are presented as antecedents of overall values of organizational innovation and also specific subtypes of innovation. And the third element is the inclusion of contextual variation, with contextual variables specified in three different categories: variation regarding the nature of decline, the perceived or objective nature of decline. For instance, the severity of decline or the expected duration of it. Variation regarding environmental factors, such as dispersion of power in the environment of the organization, or the munificence of resources available in the environment. And lastly, variation regarding organizational factors, such as the degree of centralization of decision-making, or the degree in which performance information is being used by managers. If you could go to the final slide, Faye. I would just like to share some thoughts on the use of this framework, or maybe more specifically, some of the aspects that may make conceptual frameworks like this one useful contributions to public administration scholarship. So firstly, I think that conceptual synthesis, in this case, the conceptualization of cutback management strategies, can be very useful in the sense that it provides a conceptual tool that can be applied in future research. And in this way, it enables researchers to build more coherent bodies of knowledge, to increase the ability to compare and to contrast theoretical ideas and empirical findings. Second, I thought it for the framework very important to provide complex social phenomena. They also make the theoretical reasoning and the theoretical implications explicit, and thereby they also aid the systematic investigation and falsification of theoretical claims. Thirdly, I think explicit attention for contextual variation is very useful to identify the situational circumstances that may serve as boundary conditions for the occurrence or the effectiveness of administrative behavior. So in this case, these cutback management strategies, and the inclusion of specific contextual variables, it aids the application, but also replication of theories across institutional or national boundaries. And for research on comparative public administration, the specification of specific contextual variation to specific contextual variables on the level of organizations, I think this allows us to go beyond accounts of context merely as sort of variation in terms of administrative systems, or cultures, but allows us to pinpoint specific environmental or organizational constructs. Fourth and finally, I think conceptual frameworks like this one, they can really serve to facilitate reflection and organizational action in administrative practice. For instance, the conceptualization of these cutback management strategies, it can be used by decision makers in practice to reflect on the type of strategies that they are currently using. And it can also help them to gain an understanding of the role of context, for instance, to develop more appropriate or more effective cutback management strategies to deal with future instances of financial decline. So those were some of the reflections I wanted to share on with regards to my paper. I'm looking forward to the contribution of the other panelists and of course to the discussion with you all.
Thank you.
Oh, I think you muted yourself again, Kirk.
Oh, apologies there. But thank you so much, Joris. And we'll move now to Patrick Kenis, who borrows from classical organizational theory to understand interorganizational networks.
Thank you very much, Kirk, and thank you very much for organizing this this webinar. Great to see so many friends and colleagues from all around the world. It's really nice to be here. I'm happy to present this paper and the history of this paper and some of the building blocks of this this paper, which I wrote together with Kirk Raab, who I expect also to be around, and he can also answer to some questions later. Now, the theory which explains how this paper came about is actually a garbage can theory, which might be familiar to some of you. It's actually maybe you can stay on the first slide, Faye. That would be great. I'm just talking a little bit how this paper came about. It's really garbage can theory, which says there are solutions and there are problems and there are stages for decision making or stages for action. And the stage for action was here. It was actually a conference at University of Arizona, organized by Brent and Andrew, and it was really great in November 2018. And we were asked whether we would like to contribute something on organizational thinking and organizational theory. And I was thinking, I had been working on organizational networks for a while. Actually, I wrote a paper with Keith Proven in 2008, which was published in JPOD, and now it's considered as a contribution to organizational theory because I thought we have described and developed a new organizational form in the traditional von Mintzberg's organizational forms, and so this organizational networks being a new organizational form. And then, because of the nice opportunity, the stage in University of Arizona, I started to think we should maybe dig in a little bit deeper into organizational theory to make sense of organizational networks. Faye, first slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And so that's that brought us to this kind of argument, and I thought, let's think again what successful organizational networks do differently compared to less successful networks. And the literature which developed in the last 10, 15 years, thanks to many of you who are also present here, is that we found evidence for many factors, a whole list of factors, tens of factors, which are actually proposed to be important in explaining successful organizational networks. But the interesting thing is there is a lot of interdependence between these factors, and because things become so complex, and we have seen many interesting schemes trying to make sense of when organizational networks function or not, we get this whole kind of interdependency of factors, and then the question comes up: how generalizable is that? How valid are all these factors, especially if you look at the combinations of these? And the idea I was thinking, should we add some more factors to the list and to the interdependencies, or should we try to find another way to look at the phenomena, or an alternative way of or something adding to the to this whole puzzle? So that's also what the title says a little bit, back to the future, or as they say in French, reculer pour mieux sauter. Let's go back to the basics of organizational thinking, and that's actually what we did. And so we decided to borrow from organization studies, and organization studies is actually a field which actually has a great tradition, I think, starting from Max Weber and Max Weber's translation into English, and the following contingent theories and so on and so forth. So I thought this might be a good thing to look at, and especially it's also a field I have done work in before, and I've also been teaching, and that's maybe a tip. Huh? Try to teach courses in theories, not only in organization theories, but in theories, because my experience is that if you have to teach them, then you really try to, and you have to understand them very well. And this is a very good basis for writing papers later, because you get a real good understanding of it. Next slide, please. So what we did in developing the theory, of course, if you want to apply a theory to a certain phenomena, then there must be a kind of a fit between the field of the theory and the field in which you want to apply it. And this is not so straightforward when you're talking about networks or organizational networks, because the first question which comes up, and that is discussed by some people, can organizational networks actually be considered to be organizations? And if you look at many definitions of organizations which are around, you would say they're not, because they actually describe structures and processes which do not link to the classical organization. But then I thought, let's go back to the classical definition, which I also very often use in my courses. And if you look at that definition, something very interesting appears. A definition where I said organization systems of coordinated action among individuals and groups with preferences, information, interests, highly differentiated. Organization theories describe the delicate conversion of conflict into cooperation, mobilization of resources, and the coordination of efforts to facilitate the joint survival of an organization and its members. And I like this this definition so much, because it doesn't tell you anything normative about how the structure should look like, who is in charge. It's very open, and it's really nice. And this definition looks almost, which is quite improbable, but it looks almost as if it was written for organizational networks. So that's the first point where we really got very excited about going on and using organizational theory. Next slide, please. So then the question, of course, which organization theory would be appropriate to apply. And I was thinking, and there are many possibilities. You could think of institutional theory. You could think of transaction cost theory. By the way, I think that the paper, so that's for everybody who is looking for papers, they want to write, yeah. It would be, I'm still looking, and maybe somebody has it, and so I'll learn it from the chat, but I'm still looking for the paper on organizational networks and transaction cost theory. But okay, that's just a footnote. So what we did, we decided to go for organizational design theory. Organizational design theory being, it's also quite known, of course. It's the Mintzberg approach is also very much organizational design theory perspective. So the idea is that the organizational design is very, very important in explaining the organizational performance, and so that's actually what we took as a starting point. Next slide, please. So we then, we looked at what does that organizational design theory says. It's a rather simple theory, but still very nice because it goes back. So the approach we took, it goes back to the fundamentals of organization, and the fundamentals of organization are actually differentiation and integration. Differentiation being division of tasks, division of labor, and integration between the idea of how do you bring these things together. And so on the basis of this classical organizational theory principles, the question is what tasks need to be done, who is actually doing these tasks, where are the rewards for doing these tasks, and where is and is there information system to conduct these tasks. We actually use this scheme, and we try to figure out whether it would be interesting to look at organizational networks from that perspective. And actually, it was quite exciting. It was quite exciting to see actually that these 4 questions, because the nice thing about this scheme is that it doesn't provide answers from an organizational perspective, from a theoretical perspective, but it asks questions from a theoretical perspective. So the idea is that these are the 4 essential problems of organizing, and that every organizational system or organization needs to think about solutions, or needs to find solutions to these 4 problems. So it doesn't say what the solutions are, but it asks the questions: is the organization capable of finding solution to these 4 questions? And then we started to looking at some empirical evidence. We studied one case in our paper just as an illustrative case, but also we looked at many other cases. And what we actually found out is that many organizational networks seem to be very good in functional differentiation, because that's one of the basic ideas of organizational networks. You have to deal with wicked or complex problems, and so you need a differentiated set of competencies, partners, and so on and so forth. This was very well taken into account in practice, but also in theory. There's much written about. And what we found out is that when it comes to the integration part, so the question of what are the rewards actually for actors to be involved in organizational networks, and what is actually, how does information provision actually work within organizational networks? This has been much less addressed, and there are good arguments to think why these factors are as important as the 2 other factors in explaining the effectiveness of organizational networks. So starting from these questions, you can, there is also a research agenda to find out how does reward provision actually work in organizational networks compared to others. We found some evidence in the one case we studied and we presented, but there is a whole area for research, I think. Next slide, please. And so from this exercise, especially from building a theory perspective, we actually learned a number of things, several things, which are on the next slide. I got muted. Yeah. The first thing is that the theory is indeed applicable in the empirical setting of organizational networks. So this is quite nice, and it's not just based on this paper, but it's also based on, we have used this theory now in other settings as well, and it seems to be quite applicable. And I'm not completely surprised about that, given the very nice starting definition we could use for what organizations are. And the next thing about this theory, and is maybe somewhat different from, or not different from other theories, but when we talk about theories, we always very often think about statements actually explaining or predicting or expecting causal explanations. Now, what this theory does, it focuses more on the social mechanisms. So the reconstructions of the processes account for a given phenomena. So in this theory, we look actually for how organizational networks develop solutions to these 4 problems. And so it's the process of developing these solutions and the kind of solutions which are developed in different networks is actually more the mechanism which are described here. So it's actually also to, Kirk mentions this also in her very nice paper. It's this is more based on Max Weber's verstehen. So the understanding is not a very good explanation, but okay, we can live with it. But it's more understanding the process of how things occur. And then the last point, the theory seems to have a high level of practicality. We used it in several settings. I'm actually now involved in work with eight municipalities in the Netherlands, which is fighting child poverty project. It's about fighting child poverty, and we're actually using in these 8 municipalities, we're not actually using this theory in a very practical sense. So we'll go through the exercise of who should be, of what do we need to fight child poverty. Who could do that? Who could do these different things? What are the incentives for the different organizations or to participate, or the actors can also be individuals, of course, and what kind of information system is there, so people know what to do when and where, and these kind of things. And we're in the midst of this. It's a research, but it's also we're working in practice very much, and it seems to work quite well. So that's it for the moment. Thank you very much, Kirk.
Thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate that work and your presentation today. So let's move on to Gregg, who has sort of a different approach in his essay, where he's advocating for an incremental development of theory in this new subfield of behavioral, well, I shouldn't say so new, public administration. So with that, Gregg.
Okay, thanks, Kirk, and thanks for organizing this this webinar. I think I think it's the interest in it is a sign that a lot of us in the field of public management and public administration have, kind of questions about how theory is used and how to develop theory and the role of theory. And I think it's kind of, I look forward to very much to kind of the discussion about this, because I think we all have struggled with it, and it's kind of figuring out the proper role of theory, and particularly in a kind of an applied sort of policy-oriented field like public administration. And yeah, I know that's been true in my own experience. I think so. To say so a bit about this paper, I think what Kirk wanted us. Could you stay on the first slide for a second? So I just wanted to say that because I think what Kirk wanted us to talk a bit about is sort of how we sort of came up with the theoretical ideas or insights that we wrote about in these papers, sort of the process of theorizing, which Kirk writes about in her essay. And I would recommend that essay as a really good introduction overview of sort of some of the issues and frameworks for beginning to think about the role of theory in public administration, public management, governance studies. And one of the distinctions she makes in that article is the sort of theory as a product versus theory as a kind of a process, a sort of a theory building. And I think so to talk a little bit about the process for this article. So this is so I've done a lot of experimental and behavioral work in the field, and sort of my approach has been largely kind of empirical, and I've tested different theories, but also sort of been part of this broader kind of behavioral public administration sort of trend in the field, and I've been to a lot of conferences and read a lot of papers and about it, and so it's been in my mind sort of what sort of what the what this whole movement of using sort of behavioral science and experimental methods in public management, sort of what is its sort of, what are its prospects, and how is it working, and how should we think about it. So that's been a part of my work for the last 10 years or so. And but the way that this paper came about is I kind of in the beginning of the pandemic, I like a lot of us, we sort of suddenly got locked down and stuck at home, and I was sort of I began just sort of going down a rabbit hole with the work of Charles Lindblom, because I knew about his original essay, The Science of Muddling Through, and but what I hadn't realized is he had written a lot more about the those ideas in his later work, and in particular he has a book published around 1980 called Usable Knowledge, which goes much more in depth to these ideas of the role of social science and public policy and social problem solving. And then he's got this very lengthy work that's more kind of even more developed called Inquiry and Change, inquiry as in social inquiry, and change as in social change, and where he kind of even further develops these ideas of how the role of social science in social problem solving. And I was just sort of fascinated with his ideas, and I was just reading for just, I don't know, enjoyment or just enlightenment or whatever. I was just kind of stuck at home and kind of reading these books, and then it kind of occurred to me that a lot of some key things of what he was saying could help shed light on this practice of behavioral public administration, or the use of science, behavioral science in public administration. So I would say in terms of the process of theory development, it was sort of, just, and maybe that's kind of a clue as to how to sort of develop theory, is just sort of read widely, keep your mind open, and read about things you don't necessarily expect to apply right away, but sometimes you gain insights from doing that then shed light on something that you're doing. So that's what happened with this paper. I began to realize like what he was talking about in terms of, so his general perspective is one of kind of a little bit of skepticism about the role of theory. He believes in a way that a lot of social problems and policy problems are solved more by human interaction and by kind of learning by doing and by incremental testing, and that the role of social theory is much more limited in a way than is sometimes assumed. And so, and I kind of thought about the way in which behavioral public administration kind of operates under the assumption that there's a theory, sort of a deep, theory of human behavior that can be understood and then applied in rigorous ways to governance. And yet at the same time, what people are doing in behavioral public administration, often, and particularly in these nudge units is they're really testing things in a kind of incremental way. And they're often not driven as much by the behavioral science theory as they present themselves to be driven by that theory. In other words, there's sort of, and Pestema he wrote some interesting articles on the difference between the way that behavioral science in government is presented in kind of a front stage way and sort of presenting it as a very science-driven kind of approach, whereas in practice, it's much more incremental and applied. So go to the next slide. So that insight sort of got me going on this article, and then the construction of the article, essentially, my argument is that sort of despite sort of this grounding of behavioral science and policy, which includes behavioral economics, behavioral public policy, behavioral public administration, despite its sort of grounding in prestigious theories of behavioral science, and this includes like the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and Richard Thaler and others who have important insights, but in a way, sometimes the theory is presumed to be sort of so well known and so well established that it's going to be a good guide to action, that and it turns out to be a helpful guide, but not nearly as comprehensive as it sometimes purports to be. So it's very much a kind of a prestigious sort of theory, but yet a rather mixed picture of contradictory results. And there have been a couple meta-analyses and studies that look at the overall effectiveness of these different nudges and behavioral science interventions in government, in policy settings. And it's been a very mixed set of results, weak results, contradictory results, a lot of null results. And I've learned that in my own experience doing my own work. And so, and one way to kind of explain that is that maybe the theory itself is not precise enough to make strong predictions in very specific settings, and that a more incremental approach where things are tested and that's where I think tested in a repeated sort of ongoing process, which is what Charles Lindblom talks about in his Science of Muddling Through, is that it's often important to recognize that in practice, learning about how policies work or don't work happens in a less sort of theoretically driven way, and in more of a kind of learning by trial and error kind of method. And that's sort of what happens in a lot of these nudge units, is they do try things don't work, they adjust them, they try them again. And that maybe we should sort of conceptualize behavioral public administration more as a kind of incremental science of muddling through, rather than as a kind of a rigorous sort of theory-driven science. So anyway, I make that argument. I go through sort of the theoretical justifications for behavioral public administration. I talk about some of the contradictory null findings in the meta-analyses. I talk about Lindblom's perspective on it. And then I look at also at the example of business experiments, because there's a lot of experimental work in business that takes on this very incremental kind of approach. A lot of the major tech companies and stuff do hundreds and thousands of experiments and learn by incremental adjustment rather than necessarily having strong theory in advance. If you go to the next slide. So one of the things, I'm just going to wrap up with, so one of the points I'm making is that that behavioral public administration is sometimes considered a theory-driven approach, where behavioral science theory suggests an intervention, which is tested experimentally, and then there's results that feed back onto the development of theory. But I kind of argue that approach is not realistic. In fact, is not even what's done in practice. If you go to the next slide, but rather behavioral science is one of a number of inputs into the design of interventions, which include the other inputs include practical knowledge, design thinking, user feedback, user input, and that these interventions are really bundles of reforms, some of which are theory driven, some of which are more driven by practical insights. Those bundles are tested and the results feed back onto the design of the bundle, but maybe not necessarily to the development of theory. And that's sort of a perspective that's sort of more incremental, more based on local practical knowledge, and maybe less dependent on the foundational behavioral theory than is sometimes presumed. So that's a paper. It's a short sort of essay piece, and it again, it kind of came out of connecting the older ideas of Lindblom with the new sort of movement of behavioral science and public management. So I'll just leave it there and look forward to questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was terrific. And across the three of you, we've been looking at different units of analysis, different conceptual objects, if you will, or constructs, and approaches to theory that I hope will stimulate more questions and and see how we might approach them, if not answer some of them for you now. So for those of you who have listened through this this past hour, please go ahead and tee up more Q&A. We've got some questions here for us to start with. And the first from Matthew McKenna about the difference between and a concept, and are they distinct? And if you go back to this simple definition that I suggested, is sort of resonates with many of those who've written about this, the concept itself, which some talk about as an object. The closer you get to physical or natural sciences, you would talk about it perhaps as an object, but the concept of the construct in and of itself may be of great interest, but it's in understanding those in relationship to each other. So their interaction of some kind seems to be really key to the idea of a theory, a claim about a relationship between two or more concepts or constructs. So I would argue, but perhaps some of the other panelists would disagree, that there is a difference. And I will just mention, with respect to the next question, with regard to frameworks, I direct you to Eleanor Ostrom's piece on the distinctions between theory, frameworks, and models. And she would argue that frameworks are indeed different from theories. She would say that frameworks identify and categorize objects and general relationships. And from frameworks can come then theoretical claims about how certain elements within a framework are related to one another. Not unlike, I think, what Patrick was doing in his review of those key tasks for organizations to confront. Would any of you panelists, before I direct the third question to Joris specifically, like to comment on the first or second question? No other takers? Okay, so have you had a chance, Joris, to explore what Aditya Sai Futain, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, with respect to the ontology and process you went through while theorizing?
Thank you, Kirk. I did have a sneak peek already during the presentations at what kind of questions are being asked. So as I understand the question, it's sort of like, does this idea of these relationships that I identify between organizational decline and innovation, is it informed by the literature? Is it more maybe sort of an original idea? I think many of those. I think that the framework that I present, its novelty, maybe it's mostly sort of derived by maybe sort of combining ideas that are out there in different parts of the literature. As I understand the literature on organizational decline and innovation, it's very intensively studied in the general management sciences. And then it's mostly a literature about the degree or the intensity of financial decline and what it does to innovation. And then there are sort of competing theories that explain the processes or the mechanisms leading to different outcomes. And it's quite a different literature, I think, although related, from how public administration researchers have addressed this question, because they have mostly focused on identifying strategies through which organizations can respond to organizational decline. So yeah, I sort of did my work in trying to master both of these theories or these literatures, and I think that allowed me to sort of make a original combination by putting the two together, resulting in the framework that I present in the paper. So it's I think that's why I also sort of am a bit hesitant of calling it a theory, or I think it's mostly sort of like a bringing together of different views, different ideas that results in a framework that allows us to empirically or to theoretically study a relationship that is of interest. But I feel that this question is quite a lot sort of substantively about the paper, and this may not be of general interest here to everyone. So I would just invite Aditya, if you have additional sort of questions about the paper, feel free to shoot me an email, and then we can discuss maybe more in depth. I don't know if Kirk is still with us. She's sort of frozen on my screen. Now it's time for leadership. Who will step in? Oh, Kirk is back. Great.
Sorry about that. I hope that did that throw everybody out? I hope not.
It was just a few seconds.
Okay. So someone has mentioned in the chat that you all cannot see the questions, which I wasn't aware of. I don't know, Fai, if you could maybe cut and paste them into the chat, and I will try to read them more thoroughly. Apologies for my summary reaction. So, okay, I guess Aaron is saying click on Q&A. It might be in those dots on the bottom of your screen. So apparently others can see them. So Ron Wright asks of the panelists about a point that Gregg mentioned in terms of teaching and teaching as a source of theory. And he's had some at the blackboard mini epiphanies when students ask questions that he realizes he hadn't thought through well enough. Do some of you have examples of this, or other ways of teaching informed theory, understanding, development?
Well, I would just note that I think that was Patrick who made that point. So
oh, I'm sorry. All right,
he has comments on that.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And yeah, that is actually also what happened in my case. When you teach theories and you discuss them with students, yeah, it gives a greater insight, and sometimes they also have to take it from a completely different perspective, and yeah, it enriches your own thinking, but also you're thinking about how this theory could be, between parentheses, could be improved or generalized, especially if you're teaching international classes. You really become aware of the of how little generalizability some of the theories are we're using. And my excuses to our friends from Britain and the United States, but I mean, the great thing is that many of these theories and this theoretical thinking has been developed there, but you also realize how limited they are in different contexts, in different perspectives, and also what Louisa just mentions, in different dynamism in a changing world. So I think that's really also a challenge when it comes to theorizing, to really think about how probably are they in different cultural, geographical contexts, and in time, while things are changing so fast. So great comment, thank you.
So Louise asks, in rapidly changing complex environments, how can theory possibly guide change?
I can try to take a shot at this one. I understand the question a little bit as, yeah, if the environment is constantly changing and the world changes so fast, then yeah, how can sort of our theories be of general applicability, or how they can they inform challenges that we have not yet met before? And I think the answer to this question is to devote much more attention to explicitly incorporating context into our theories. And we tend to sort of think, maybe also a bit inspired by economists or by psychologists, of theory as sort of these grand sort of universally applicable laws. But it's also maybe in an applied science like public administration, very interesting to think of contextual boundary conditions or scoping conditions that inform in what circumstances a certain theory applies, and in which ones not. And that's why I think this sort of development that we see right now in comparative public administration research, where I think in recent years we are really seeing sort of a boom and an interest in learning from different contexts around the world. And I think that's really much needed. And I think we could even further strengthen this by by making in those comparative pieces or by work being conducted in contexts that not have been studied before, to make context an explicit point of attention there, so that we have sort of much more insight in what situations do our theories apply and to what extent.
I would just kind of jump in because I think that the that question that Luis raises is kind of related to one of I think one of Lindblom's insights about the role of theory and social problem solving is that there's a limit to what I think, and it's important, I think, to sometimes be a little more humble about what the potential is for theory to solve certain social problems, and that, you know, we need as social scientists to recognize that sometimes social policies and social problem solving happens through other mechanisms than sort of the scientific model of, you know, sort of understanding the world in a comprehensive way and therefore prescribing solutions that then get carried out, that the process of learning about what works and doesn't work and what solutions are to problems happens sometimes in a more kind of social or interactive way, and, you know, that maybe we need to kind of incorporate that into our thinking or expectations about the role of theory in public administration. You know, the examples he uses often have to do more with, like, and what economists say often is that it has to do, like, the way in which markets sometimes solve problems without there being a self-conscious sort of theory about that, through using sort of, you know, interactions in the marketplace with, you know, price signals, and there's sort of coordination and solving of problems that don't necessarily come from a well-established theory about what that solution should be. It's so people arrive at solutions to problems sometimes through their, you know, political or economic or social interactions. So sometimes maybe that perspective kind of changes your expectations about the role of theory in our field.
Maybe I could.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just noticed that Kirk is gone, but Patrick, take it away.
Fine. Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm also intrigued by the question of change, because theories are in a certain way are static. And I mean, I think it's by coincidence. It's not because Jörg and I were so smart to think about it, but it was almost by coincidence that we came to this point where we said that it's about looking for solutions to certain problems about organizing, and the definition of organizing, which you took from Marsh and Simon of 1958. The interesting things, I was really astonished that it still stays as a very useful definition, independent of all the changes we had. And it was also applied by Puranan when he was analyzing completely new forms of organizing in the business world, and it still stayed valid. So that's interesting as such, also something to theorize about in a certain way. And the other thing is that it's about looking for solution to these problems, and there is a kind of a development. If you ask a question about what kind of information approach do you need to organizational networks, then of course the solutions to that, they change and they become very, very different. So as such, it's kind of embedded into the question that you expect the changes, and you can still say something useful about these changes on the basis of this theory. I don't know whether this is very clear, but that would be my take on that. I saw that there is another question about, if I may, Faye, assuming that you take the chair now. So what would be the value in applying more than one theory in a research endeavor? That's also a nice question. And my answer would be absolutely yes. Yeah, I mean, that, as I said, to understand theories really, really very well, it's not easy. It's really hard. So you really have to understand the theories. The question is how many theories you're able to really understand very well. But of course, that is of a great value. And one of the papers who has really influenced me a lot, which I really found great, is the paper by Neil. I don't have the title in my head, but Neil Flickstein. I think it was based on his dissertation on the M divisional form of organizing. So I tried to explain why the M divisional form of organizing appeared. So it's Neil Flickstein. And what he did he actually applied 5 theories, if I remember right. He used 5 very well-developed organizational theories to try to explain and to see which theory explains better this phenomena than the other. Yeah, and that is really, it's such a nice read. Everybody who tries to experiment with applying different theories to one phenomenon, to read that paper, because also the way he did it, trying to understand the theory, trying to operationalize the different theories, find data to test them, and so on and on, and then coming to a very nice conclusion. And coming to a conclusion, not saying that every theory is fine, but it's really, he came to the conclusion that one theory does really much better than another for this specific case. So that's really something I would recommend regarding this question.
So I think there are 2 questions that can be grouped as the question about theory and practice. I think one by Michael Barsley and another one by Nuri Heckler. And we have about 15 minutes left. Does anybody want to tackle the practice versus theory questions?
Well, I would just respond to Michael Barsley's question. I think it's an interesting, an important question on the relation between theory and practice. I would say if the question is directed at my critique of the behavioral science behavioral public administration movement, I would say there that's sort of the I would say that maybe one thing that's characteristic of it is it's much more of a lot of the theory is more fundamental psychological and behavioral theory, and its connection to practice is maybe not as clearly specified, I think, as in work in our field, where that's much more kind of an ongoing concern. I mean, I think like if you think of the work of like Kahneman and Tversky and Richard Thaler and stuff, they were sort of probing basic sort of fundamental assumptions about human behavior related to largely to kind of economic theory, and I think it was sort of the application of that to practice came kind of later and sort of as a consequences of the theory, without I think an explicit attempt to kind of connect the two, which is, I think, has changed now as more and more of that kind of theory has been used to kind of motivate or support policy changes. People have begun to think more about the connection between the fundamental theory and the practice, which was partly kind of what motivated my essay. But but it's I know Michael's work has really has focused a lot on thinking of public management as more of a design science to begin with, is focused directly, the theory being directly about its connection to practice. And I think that is something that distinguishes what we're doing from some of the other social sciences.
Sorry for my departure. I also lost the thread of the Q&A. So if someone else could continue with the next questions there, I'd appreciate it.
I also see a grouping of two similar questions about normativeness of the theory. One by Karen Baylor and another one by Sean Schock. Does anybody want to tackle the normative theories intersection?
I think this was, oh, Joris, go ahead.
No, I'm very happy if you would take the floor first, Patrick. I'm probably very unsuited to answer this question. So.
Yeah, I think that was very much related to political science, and I'm not sure. Yeah, my basic assumption would be that every theory is normative in a sense, and sometimes it seems more obvious in when it's about political science, because political science is, of course, it's it's very much about values, and so this seems to be more normative, but I think all the theories we are dealing with have some normative underpinnings, and I think we should be more explicit about them. And I realize maybe it's a personal critique, so to say, because I have a PhD in political science, I should have been more explicit about maybe the normative dimensions of the theory I've been presenting. So I think that's a nice comment.
Joris, you want to add to that?
Yeah. So yeah, I think I sort of shy very much away myself from engaging in the more normative aspects of public administration as a science, but at the same time, it's obvious. I think in sort of like large scale like developments now in terms of, for instance, research being done on digitalization and use of algorithms, or also I guess with regards to climate change and sustainability, that there are many normative issues that probably as a discipline we are not engaging with enough. And I think that there tends to be an emphasis in more sort of positivist and analytical or predictive theorizing. And maybe this also, I saw one other question in the Q&A about that as a science, we tend to have maybe limited impact in compared to some other disciplines. And maybe this is also part of the reason. So I think there's really a clear need for people to engage in normative theory. And I think it's, yeah, maybe not right to assume that for people who specialize in this, that others are not interested in it merely because it's not over present in the journals that we see. But maybe Kirk can say a bit more from her role as editor of a journal that aims to publish theoretical contributions on her perspective on this.
Yeah. Well, I think we ignore our normative assumptions, theory aside, at our peril, and that we need to be explicit about them. I don't think we need to be ashamed about that. I think, as Patrick was saying, we have them, and our theories then embody them as well. And this is an issue that is really foundational right now to public management as we try to work cross-boundary and across different kinds of political regimes to advance public management. And we have choices to make in this field. That is the reification of neutral professional public administration per se, or if it is a field that embodies certain democratic principles, transparency, openness, and inclusion. So I think we both need to recognize our own normative assumptions and make them very clear, and then also always be thinking and acknowledging the normative basis for these theories. Fi, do we have another question to take us further?
I moved the answer questions to the answer tab. So we have 6 in mind if you go to the Q&A, the open ones. But
Is Jennifer's the last question? Jennifer Dodge?
yes, there's also
Well, Jennifer actually adds to this comment about, yes, we can approach normative questions analytically. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, here I do see more comments. Well, we're getting close. Have we addressed most of them? Again, apologies for my disconnect there. Maybe it is time for me to thank all of you, those who we can't see, for joining us, and the panelists and Fi as well. Min Woo happens to be on your screen. He was a prior editorial assistant and helped us in setting up our panel. So he is there live behind those screens. I just wanted to note that at PMRC, which will be live and in person in Phoenix at the end of May, we will be having another theory roundtable sponsored by PPMG, and we'll look carefully at these questions and comments that you've provided us today and see how we can address them further and incorporate some of these into that roundtable. I want to make a plug for attending PMRC if you can. And I also want to encourage you to become, if you aren't already, a member of PMRA, and please sign up for the journal updates for new articles and issues. Also keep submitting and reviewing manuscripts for PPMG, and hopefully we will see you in Phoenix. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Gregg and Patrick and Joris and Fi, of course, for our time here together today. So all the best, and we look forward to seeing you live in another few months. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Kirk. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Fi.